So have you ever just felt completely overwhelmed by, all the information flying around? Or maybe stuck in a really tough decision?
Oh, absolutely. It happens to everyone, right? Which is why today we're doing this deep dive. We've got some fascinating stuff from an audiobook called Critical Thinking Mastery: Transform Your Mindset for Ultimate Personal Growth.
Exactly. And our mission here is really to unpack the key ideas from these excerpts. What is critical thinking? How do you develop it? What are the real benefits?
Yeah, think of it as maybe a shortcut to getting well informed on this. We're pulling out the main strategies and takeaways the source offers.
Because honestly, being able to navigate challenges, make good decisions, solve problems, just cutting through all the noise, it's so essential today for everything, really. Personal life, work life.
Definitely. And the source material really promises quite a transformation, doesn't it? Some surprising facts, practical insights you can actually use.
Okay, so let's dive in. Let's unpack this. According to the source, what is critical thinking at its core? Like, what are we really talking about?
Well, first off, the source is really clear about what it isn't. It's not about, just being argumentative or shooting down ideas you don't like.
Right.
Instead, it's framed as a much more disciplined approach. It's about analyzing information, evaluating it carefully, synthesizing it to arrive at well-reasoned judgments.
So, stepping back a bit, being more objective.
Exactly. Really thinking about how you're thinking. And it tackles that misconception, too, the idea that it's some kind of innate talent.
Right, like you've either got it or you don't.
Yeah, and the source says, nope, that's not it. It's very much presented as a skill, something you can train, like building a muscle. It takes practice, conscious effort.
That's actually really encouraging. And the benefits seem huge based on what the source lays out.
They really are broad. In your personal life, it talks about stronger relationships, better communication, more empathy, handling conflict better, making decisions that actually line up with your values. And professionally, well, it's highlighted as something employers are increasingly looking for. It's what sets leaders and innovators apart, apparently.
So it's not just some academic thing. It's about changing your whole approach to, everything.
Precisely. It's about learning to question your own assumptions, challenge your biases, approach problems with maybe more creativity and open-mindedness.
Okay, so where do you even begin with that? How do you start building that muscle?
The source suggests starting inward, which is interesting. It says you first need to understand, and I quote loosely here, the complex landscape of our own minds.
Right, okay. So before we analyze the world, we analyze ourselves. The source talks about the mind being like this vast, unexplored territory.
It does. A territory with, hidden treasures, insights, creativity, but also treacherous pitfalls. And those pitfalls are our biases, our misconceptions, the things that can trip us up without us even noticing.
And that's where self-awareness comes in. It calls it the cornerstone.
Absolutely, the cornerstone. Being an impartial spectator to your own thoughts, feelings, behaviors.
That sounds difficult. Being impartial about yourself.
It is. But the source suggests that detachment helps you start seeing the patterns. How your past experiences or your current emotions are maybe coloring how you see things right now.
So how do you actually do that? How do you become that spectator? Any practical tips from the source?
Yeah, a couple of main techniques. First one is mindfulness. Just, paying attention to what's going through your head, what you're feeling right now, but without judging it. The idea is if you practice this, you start catching those little habitual thought loops or recognizing what triggers certain emotional reactions, stuff you'd normally miss.
Okay, mindfulness. And the other one?
Reflective journaling. Actually writing down your thoughts, feelings, decisions. Creating a kind of record of your inner world.
How does that help?
Well, seeing it written down can apparently reveal patterns you wouldn't otherwise notice. Like maybe you realize you consistently jump to the worst case scenario, catastrophize. Or maybe you tend to make snap judgments.
I can see how writing it down might make some uncomfortable truths pretty obvious.
Exactly. The source definitely acknowledges that. You are likely going to bump up against some uncomfortable stuff about yourself, and particularly your cognitive biases.
Okay, let's talk about those biases. The source really seems to hammer home their importance. What exactly are they?
They're described as these systematic errors in thinking. Basically, shortcuts your brain takes, heuristics. They're usually efficient for quick judgments, but they can seriously lead you astray when things get complex. And they often operate below conscious awareness.
Below awareness, right. Does it give some clear examples?
Oh, yeah. Confirmation bias is a big one. that tendency we all have to look for and remember information that confirms what we already believe.
Right. So if I think, I don't know, that cold showers are amazing, I'll notice every article saying that and kind of ignore the ones that say they don't do much.
Exactly that. You seek out the confirming stuff. And then there's the availability heuristic.
What's that one?
That's when we overestimate how likely something is just because it's easy to remember or imagine. Things that are vivid or recent stick in our minds.
Like worrying more about a plane crash than a car crash, even though statistically.
That's the classic example the source uses. Plane crashes are dramatic. They get tons of news coverage, so they feel more threatening, even if driving is actually riskier day to day.
Wow. Okay, so recognizing these in yourself, if they're below conscious awareness, that sounds really, really tough.
The source is upfront about that. It is tough. But it's presented as absolutely essential if you want to improve your critical thinking. It's step one.
Any suggestions for getting around our own blind spots? Maybe getting an outside view?
Yes, definitely. It suggests actively seeking feedback from others, people you trust who might see patterns or assumptions in you that you just don't.
That takes some vulnerability, though.
Huge vulnerability, the source notes. You have to be genuinely open to hearing things that might, well, sting a little.
So that feeling of resistance, or maybe getting defensive when you're doing this self-reflection or getting feedback, that's maybe not a bad sign.
According to the source, it's actually a sign you're on the right track. That discomfort means you're pushing against those ingrained habits of thought. It's necessary for developing mental flexibility. It's a sign of growth.
Okay, so we start inward. Self-awareness, spotting biases. Got it. What's the next layer in building critical thinking skills according to the source?
Right. So once you've started that inner work, you need the actual tools. The source uses an analogy like an explorer needs more than a map. They need tools. And the core tools here are logical reasoning and evidence-based thinking.
Logical reasoning.
Yeah.
We call that the backbone.
That's the term, yeah.
Yeah.
It's about drawing valid conclusions from evidence, making sure your arguments hold water, essentially, identifying your starting points, your premises, and seeing if they logically lead to your conclusion.
And it uses that simple cat example.
Right, the syllogism. All cats are mammals. Fluffy is a cat. Therefore, Fluffy is a mammal. Simple deductive reasoning. If the first two statements are true, the third has to be true. It shows a valid logical structure.
But I mean, most arguments aren't that neat and tidy. The source talks about logical fallacies, right? Errors in reasoning.
Exactly. These are super important to understand. Fallacies are flaws in the logic that make an argument invalid, even if it sounds convincing on the surface. Learning to spot them in others' arguments and, crucially, avoid them in your own thinking is key, especially with all the persuasive messages flying around today.
What kinds of fallacies does it point out?
It mentions a few common ones. Ad hominem, attacking the person, not their argument. False dichotomy, acting like there are only two choices when there might be many. And the slippery slope, arguing that one small step will inevitably lead to some disastrous chain reaction without real evidence.
Okay, that makes sense. So that's the logic part. What about the evidence side? Evidence-based thinking?
That's the other pillar. Basically, grounding your conclusions in verifiable facts and reliable data, not just relying on your gut feelings or what you wish were true, or maybe one story someone told you.
So it means actively looking for good information.
Yes, seeking out high-quality sources, questioning their credibility, really evaluating the evidence itself, and, importantly, being willing to change your mind if strong evidence comes along that contradicts what you thought.
That sounds like it requires a certain mindset and attitude.
It really does. The source highlights a few key attitudes. Curiosity, just genuinely wanting to know more, ask questions, explore alternatives. Open-mindedness, being willing to actually consider ideas that challenge your current beliefs.
And intellectual humility.
But that's a big one. Recognizing that you don't know everything, that your knowledge is incomplete, and being willing to learn from others, even people you disagree with.
Those attitudes almost sound like the fuel for the whole critical thinking engine.
They really are foundational. It's about having a healthy skepticism, but also a deep commitment to learning.
And the source emphasizes this isn't easy. It's not passive.
Not at all. It means consciously stepping out of your comfort zone sometimes, facing those biases head on, admitting you might be wrong. But the source insists the payoff is huge.
Okay, so we've got self-awareness, the tools of logic and evidence, the right mindset. But those biases keep coming up. The source calls them hidden players.
Yeah, that analogy comes back because overcoming biases is such a persistent challenge. Like in chess, these hidden players are influencing your moves, your judgments, often without you even knowing they're there.
And just to reiterate, the source says, these aren't character flaws, right? They're just how our brains are wired.
Exactly. Systematic errors, mental shortcuts, heuristics. They evolved to help us make quick judgments, which is useful sometimes, but really detrimental when we need careful, critical thought.
And it revisits specific biases with more examples.
Yes. Confirmation bias gets another mention, remember the diet example. Seeking out articles that support your view, ignoring ones that don't. It's about filtering reality to fit what you already think.
Got it. And the anchoring effect.
That's about getting stuck on the first piece of information you hear. The car price example is perfect. That initial sticker price, even if it's inflated, often anchors the whole negotiation. Everything else is judged relative to that first number.
Right. And the availability heuristic again.
Yep. Reinforced with the plane crash versus car crash idea. Dramatic, easily recalled events just feel more probable, even if the stats say otherwise. What comes to mind easily sways our judgment.
So, knowing about them isn't enough. The source must offer strategies to actively combat them.
Definitely. Awareness is just the start. A key strategy mentioned is to actively seek out information and perspectives that challenge your own beliefs.
Ooh, that sounds uncomfortable.
It can be. But the source clarifies the goal isn't necessarily to change your mind every time, but to genuinely understand different viewpoints. It suggests things like reading publications from across the political spectrum, or maybe exploring fields totally outside your expertise, like reading science if you're in the humanities, or vice versa.
Taking deliberate steps.
Okay.
What else?
Practicing mental flexibility. Deliberately asking yourself, what are other ways to look at this? What assumptions am I making? What if the opposite were true? Basically, forcing your brain out of its usual groove.
And involving other people seems to be a recurring theme.
Absolutely crucial. Seek out diverse perspectives. Talk to people with different backgrounds, different experiences, different areas of expertise before you make up your mind on something important. They'll see blind spots you can't.
And that intellectual humility comes in again here.
It's central. If you can cultivate that humility, it's just easier to say, maybe I was wrong about that, when new evidence comes along. The source really frames changing your mind as a strength, a sign of growth, not weakness.
And that feeling of discomfort when your beliefs are challenged.
The source keeps coming back to that.
Yep.
It is uncomfortable. These biases are comfortable. But that discomfort is positioned as a necessary signal that you're actually stretching your mind, pushing your boundaries. That's where the real learning happens.
Okay, makes sense. So we're working on ourselves, getting the tools, tackling biases. How do we actually apply all this? The source talks about problem solving, right? Using critical thinking there.
Yeah, it uses a great analogy. A problem is like a tangled knot. It looks messy, maybe impossible to fix. Critical thinking gives you the systematic ways to unravel it.
What's the first step in unraveling that knot?
Defining the issue clearly. The source points out that often what seems like one big problem is actually a bunch of smaller, connected issues. So you need to break it down. Problem decomposition, it's sometimes called. Isolate the different threads.
Okay, define it, break it down. Then.
Gather information. This sounds obvious, but the source says it's often skipped or done poorly. You need to cast a wide net here. Look for data, talk to people with different viewpoints, consult experts, look for patterns, really understand the landscape of the problem.
Then you get into solutions.
Right. Generating potential solutions. This is where creativity comes in. Brainstorming. The key here, according to the source, is to suspend judgment at first. Let ideas flow freely, even the wild ones. Sometimes the best solution isn't the most obvious.
And then you bring the critical thinking back to evaluate those ideas.
Exactly. Now you rigorously evaluate. What are the pros and cons of each potential solution? Is it actually feasible? What are the likely outcomes, short-term and long-term? Any unintended consequences lurking? The emphasis here is on objectivity, trying to set aside your own pet ideas or biases.
And finally, you pick one and go.
Select the best-looking option and implement it. But it's not just implement and forget. You need an actionable, planned steps, who does what, timelines, and crucially, you need to monitor how it's going.
So problem solving is ongoing.
Very much so. Be prepared to adjust, tweak, maybe even change course based on the results you're seeing. It's iterative.
I like the idea of reframing the problem that the source mentioned.
Reframing is powerful. It's about deliberately looking at the issue from different angles, asking, Is there another way to think about this entirely? Sometimes just changing your perspective on the problem reveals completely new avenues for solutions.
What about when you just feel stuck, overwhelmed by the problem?
The source acknowledges that's totally normal. Feeling stuck, frustrated, overwhelmed, part of the process. The advice is often to take a break, step back, get some distance, let your subconscious work on it, and come back later with fresh eyes. Don't just keep banging your head against the wall.
Okay, that makes sense for problem solving. The source also applies critical thinking to analyzing information and arguments we encounter from other people.
Yes, the detective analogy comes up here. You're like a detective at the scene, examining the claims, the evidence, the reasoning, trying to figure out what holds up and what doesn't.
So how does this detective work? Where do they start?
By dissecting the argument, breaking it down into its core parts. The claim, what are they trying to convince you of? The premises, what reasons or evidence are they giving you? And the conclusion, the final point they're arguing for. It brings back that Fido the dog example to show how premises ideally lead logically to a conclusion.
And a big part is looking closely at the quality of those premises, the evidence.
Absolutely essential. You have to ask those critical questions. Is this evidence actually relevant to the claim? Is the source reliable, credible? Is there enough evidence? The source specifically warns against being swayed by just anecdotes or data that seems cherry-picked to support the point.
And looking for those patterns of reasoning again, are they logical? Or are there fallacies?
Right. It circles back to that. Is the reasoning valid, like a good syllogism? Or is it flawed? It gives that vivid slippery slope example again. If we allow X, then inevitably Y and Z will happen, often without any real proof of that chain reaction.
And the correlation versus causation thing.
A huge one to watch out for. Just because two things happen together doesn't mean one caused the other. The source uses that classic ice cream sales and drownings example. Both go up in summer, but eating ice cream doesn't cause drowning. There's a third factor, the heat.
And what about things that aren't said? Hidden assumptions.
Super important. Sometimes the most critical part of an argument is the unstated premise it relies on. The source uses the example, we should cut taxes to boost the economy. That argument rests on the hidden assumption that tax cuts do reliably boost the economy in that specific context, which is itself a claim that needs evidence and scrutiny.
The source suggests we should practice this kind of analysis all the time, on everyday stuff.
Definitely. Apply it to ads, news articles, social media posts, political speeches. You start to see that a lot of arguments that sound good on the surface actually have pretty weak foundations when you look closely.
And again, the goal isn't just to win arguments or tear things down.
No, the source stresses the goal is clearer understanding. It's about making more informed judgments for yourself, navigating that constant flood of information more effectively.
Okay, so a lot of this seems quite internal, or about analyzing external information. But how does critical thinking play out when we interact with other people, especially people who see things really differently?
That's a really crucial area the source covers, engaging with diverse perspectives. It uses this lovely analogy of being in a room with different colored walls. Each wall offers a unique view, and moving around, seeing from different walls, just enriches your understanding of the whole room.
So actively seeking out different viewpoints has real value.
Huge value. The source argues it challenges our own assumptions, forces us to see complexities we might miss, broadens our understanding, and ultimately helps us come up with better, more robust solutions or conclusions than if we just stayed in our own echo chamber.
But it also flags that this can be difficult, right?
Oh, for sure. It means stepping outside your comfort zone. It means genuinely listening to ideas that might challenge your core beliefs, that can feel uncomfortable, even threatening sometimes. But the source insists that's precisely where real growth happens.
What kind of strategies does it offer for doing this effectively, engaging across differences?
Well, one is deliberate exposure. Consciously seek out sources or talk to people who hold different views. Maybe read commentators you usually disagree with or engage with folks from totally different backgrounds or fields. The aim isn't necessarily agreement, but understanding their perspective, their why.
Which connects to active listening, I guess.
Absolutely fundamental, not just waiting for your turn to talk, but really trying to hear what they're saying and understand the experiences, values, or assumptions behind what they're saying.
And empathy plays a role here, too.
A big role. Trying to see the world through their eyes, even if you fundamentally disagree. Recognizing that most people operate from a place that makes sense to them, based on their own information and experiences.
The source mentions steel manning, That sounds interesting. What is that?
Steel manning is the opposite of straw manning. A straw man argument misrepresents someone's view to make it easy to knock down.
Right.
Steel manning is the opposite. You try to articulate the strongest, fairest, most reasonable version of the other person's argument, maybe even better than they stated it themselves.
Why would you do that?
The source suggests it does two things. First, it forces you to truly understand their position at its best. Second, it actually strengthens your own thinking because you're engaging with the most robust version of the opposing view, not a caricature.
How does bringing all these diverse perspectives into the mix affect how we make decisions?
The source says it makes decision-making potentially harder at the start, more viewpoints, more complexity to juggle, but ultimately, it leads to richer, better decisions. You have more options on the table, a better grasp of potential consequences for different groups.
And it mentions the devil's advocate role.
Yeah, as a practical technique, especially in groups. Deliberately arguing against the preferred option or assigning someone that role just to pressure test the idea and uncover potential weaknesses or unintended consequences before you commit.
But the aim isn't just to find some mushy middle ground or give up your own views.
No, the source is very clear about that. It's not about abandoning your convictions or reaching some bland consensus. It's about enriching your own understanding, stress testing your own assumptions, and arriving at conclusions that are more thoughtful and well-reasoned precisely because they've grappled with strong alternative viewpoints.
Okay, so that leads us nicely into decision-making itself. The source has a dedicated section on applying critical thinking there for strategic action.
Right, using the crossroads analogy, you're facing a choice, often with incomplete information, uncertain outcomes. It frames decision-making not as just picking something, but as a whole process.
And where does that process begin, according to the source?
Starts with defining the decision really clearly. What exactly is the choice you need to make? And then rigorously gathering relevant information. The source warns that a lot of bad decisions come from fuzziness about the actual problem or just not doing the homework on the data.
Then you apply your critical thinking to the options.
Exactly. Identify your options, then evaluate them. What are the likely outcomes short-term, long-term? What are the risks and benefits of each? How does each one align with your goals, your values? The source also nudges you to look for creative alternatives, not just the obvious path A or path B.
Is there a tool mentioned to help structure that evaluation?
Yes, the decision matrix. It's a simple grid, basically. You list your options down one side, your key criteria across the top, and then score each option against each criterion. It helps make the comparison more systematic and less purely intuitive, especially for complex choices.
What about the balance between logic and, say, intuition or gut feeling?
The source suggests using both. Definitely analyze the facts, the data, that's the critical thinking core. But don't totally ignore strong gut feelings. They might be your subconscious picking up on patterns you haven't consciously registered. The key is balance, using intuition as one input, not the only one.
And dealing with uncertainty. You almost never have all the facts.
True. Uncertainty is usually part of the package. The source mentions scenario planning as a technique. You imagine different possible futures, maybe an optimistic one, a pessimistic one, a weird one, and think about how your decision would play out in each. It helps you anticipate risks and opportunities you might otherwise miss.
Are there common traps the source warns us about in decision-making?
Oh, yeah. Two big ones mentioned are analysis paralysis.
Getting stuck just analyzing forever.
Exactly. You get so caught up in gathering information and weighing options that you never actually make the decision. The source reminds us that sometimes a good, timely decision is better than waiting forever for a perfect one that never comes.
Okay. And the other one?
Groupthink. This happens in teams where the desire for everyone to agree, to maintain harmony, overrides critical evaluation. People don't speak up with doubts, and the group can end up making irrational choices. Countering this involves actively encouraging dissent, maybe using that devil's advocate role again.
What if you just feel stuck on a decision? Any other techniques?
The source mentions a few, like the 5 whys technique to drill down to the root cause of the problem the decision is trying to solve, or the Eisenhower matrix, sorting tasks or options by urgent versus important to help prioritize. And again, sometimes just reframing the decision itself can unlock things.
So the overall goal isn't to eliminate all risk that's impossible, but to make choices that are informed, reasoned, and aligned with what matters.
That's the essence of it. Making well-reasoned choices based on the best available information and your values, while being comfortable enough with uncertainty to act and ready to adapt as things change.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground based on this source material. It really builds a comprehensive picture. Does the source talk about how to kind of sustain this, keep it going long term?
It does. The final piece it brings in is building mental resilience. It uses that image of a mighty oak tree, something that can withstand storms, bend but not break, and maybe even grow stronger because of the challenges.
So resilience isn't just about being tough.
No, it's described as more dynamic than that. It's about adapting well in the face of adversity, stress, trauma, bouncing back, learning from setbacks, maybe even thriving under pressure.
And what's the foundation for building that resilience according to the source?
A lot of it comes down to understanding and managing emotions. Emotional intelligence. If you can recognize, understand, and manage your own emotions and understand others, you're better equipped to respond to challenges with clarity and purpose instead of just reacting impulsively.
Are there specific techniques mentioned for building that emotional intelligence and resilience?
Yes, mindfulness meditation comes up again. Practicing that non-judgmental awareness of your present thoughts and feelings is seen as key for building self-awareness, reducing stress, and improving emotional regulation.
And the other technique mentioned.
Cultivating a growth mindset, drawing on Carol Dweck's work, that core belief that your abilities, your intelligence aren't fixed, that you can develop them through effort, learning, persistence.
How does that help resilience?
Well, if you have a growth mindset, you tend to see challenges not as threats, but as opportunities to learn. You see failure not as defining you, but as a temporary setback providing useful information for next time. That perspective shift is hugely resilient.
Okay, so we've really journeyed through this whole process outlined in the source. From understanding what critical thinking even is, looking inward at self-awareness and biases, building the core skills of logic and evidence, tackling those mental hurdles, then applying it all to problem-solving, analyzing arguments, engaging with different views, making decisions, and finally building the resilience to sustain it.
It's really clear from the source how interconnected all these pieces are. They build on each other to form this, well, powerful framework for navigating life, really. These aren't just abstract ideas. The source presents them as vital skills for dealing with complexity, making better choices, and achieving real personal growth. This deep dive really does offer a kind of roadmap.
And it keeps coming back to that very first step, doesn't it? Understanding our own minds.
It seems to be the absolute foundation.
So maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on after exploring all this with us. Given that the source places so much emphasis on understanding our own minds, our biases, our assumptions, our thought patterns, as the critical first step, how can you, starting today, commit to becoming a more diligent, maybe more impartial observer of your own thinking? Especially perhaps when you encounter information or ideas that make you feel uncomfortable. What's one small, concrete step you could take towards that deeper self-awareness?